Welcome to the Advantage Podcast, a monthly unscripted conversation with host David Ashcraft and top leaders impacting our world. Created by pastors for pastors to strengthen our leadership and expand our knowledge and influence.
Hey, well, welcome everybody to the Advantage Podcast, and I have a special guest with me today that I'm excited for all of you to meet. This is Stephanie Chung. Stephanie, so good to have you with us. And let me just tell you real quick what I know about Stephanie, but I'm going to ask you, Stephanie, to tell a little bit more about yourself. So Stephanie is a new friend of mine through the Global Leadership Network, and thoroughly enjoyed getting to know Stephanie and being with her and around her. She's part of our GLN faculty. She's spoken at the summit. She spoke this past year at our pastor's launch. We called it Base Camp event in February. She's a business leader first. And I'm going to ask you, Stephanie, in just a moment to tell some of your story. But probably the most recent thing, and you may say there are other things that I'm missing, but one of the most recent things is you were the first, if I understand it, the first female and the first Black person to actually lead a major aviation company, which is a huge feat. And so glad that you're with us today. Also a person of faith, which I'm going to ask you about your faith journey too. But Stephanie, thank you. Thank you for being here with us, and excited to have our guys get to meet you.
Of course. Well, thank you for having me. And I would just say one small little caveat to what you just said. I am the first Black person, first African American to ever lead a major private aviation company in the U.S. So both for men and women. But that makes me the second female to ever lead a major private
So there was a
company.
female first.
The first one was my former boss. Yep, there was a female first. Exactly. So,
Okay.
but yeah. Well, my background at the end of the day, I've been in aviation for almost 40 years. Even though I was like, I can't believe it's been that long. I've loved every minute of it. I started off as a baggage handler at the Boston Logan Airport. That was my very first aviation job. And from there, worked my way up. And so started off at load and luggage, and then went into sales, and then got recruited into private aviation. So I've spent the last 20 plus years in private aviation, and I did everything from selling, private charter to selling private jets to overseeing sales teams that sell private jets, and then becoming a president. So ran an entire private aviation company. And then my most recent gig was I was the founding chief growth officer for Wheels Up, which is a publicly traded private aviation company, one of the largest in the world.
That's great. Fun to hear that. Now, if I could go back on your story a little bit, Stephanie, your dad was a military person.
Yes.
So you traveled a lot. And I think that's where you even got your fascination in aviation, was just being around military bases and seeing lots of planes. And
Exactly. So my dad, you're right, was a master sergeant in the U.S. Air Force. And so I grew up literally hearing planes take off and land my entire life, right? So I've always lived on active Air Force bases, and I learned to love aviation. And I actually knew early on that I wanted to be in aviation. That's all I ever wanted to do. And so it made sense that I went right from, as soon as I could work, went right into the airlines, and have truly enjoyed the career. I just can't picture myself doing something else. Even though right now I am on the speaking circuit, I am not doing as much in aviation now as I am on the speaking circuit. And then, of course, my book, which I know we'll talk about later.
yeah, very good. So talk about real quick, let's stay with aviation for a moment. And you were
Sure.
breaking all kinds of ceilings, I guess, let's say, where
Mhm.
I think if I have heard your story correctly, when you first started, there were no other models for you of at least anybody rising very far up in the aviation world other than baggage handlers and things like that. And so what
Mhm.
motivated you to keep going, and how did you even ascend to where you did?
Oh, that's a great question. Nobody's ever asked me that. That's a very good question. So, what's really interesting, David, is I can honestly tell you, this is where you really believe that God's just got, your steps ordered, right? Because when I first got into aviation, that is a big industry. So I didn't know all the tools that were available and all the different opportunities that were available. So when I was younger, growing up, it's interesting because in aviation, when I was younger, I would only see, if you were a man, like if I saw aviation depicted in film or TV or movies or anything like that, if you were a man, you were a pilot. And if you were a woman, you were a flight attendant. But none of those images ever looked like me. We're talking, a long time ago, right? So I never saw a person of color as an aviator in any type of magazines, film, TV, or what have you. So I didn't know what I could do. So I knew I wanted to be in aviation, but didn't know what I could do. So I started off very, very bottom of the ladder, which of course is loading luggage, checking customers in for their flight. So that's how I started. Thankfully, I had, God bless me, with people who would just speak one word. And I'm pretty, you know me, you know my style. It doesn't take a whole lot to convince me on anything, right? And so I had the first person, I remember his name was Jim. Jim was a good old boy from the South. And Jim was like, Stephanie, every time I come to this airport, I see you serving customers, smile on your face. I think we got you in the wrong position. I think you should be in sales. And then I was like, okay, so I moved into sales. Then, worked for some really great sales leaders who were like, I think you should be in corporate sales. Okay, and I did that. Or I'd have people recruit and say, Steph, I would love to have you come over to my, airline. So, and I'm let you make up whatever job you want to do. Okay, so I kind of go with the flow. And it's been really, really a blessing to do that, because I think God's used me, because I'm like, I'll go with the flow. Like, sure. All right, let's try it. And each step, though, what I will say is, growing up a military brat, because you're around excellence your whole life, that is the standard. And so everywhere I went, I knew that I needed to do an excellent job. And that's, and I did it. And then that usually got me the next promotion and the next promotion. And so I feel like leaders who were above me would just know, if you put Stephanie in there, she's going to get the job done. And then I would do it. And then that would lead to the next promotion. So I'm incredibly grateful for the different leaders I've had. They've not been, all people that I'd write books about, right? But I've certainly needed them and learned when I needed to learn from them for the stage that God had me in, until I went to the next level. So.
Yeah, that's good. So 2 questions real quick. One, you mentioned military brat. And so I don't know that it's interesting that you said that caused you to strive for excellence. And so I don't know that I've ever thought of that before. So I might get you to expand on that a little bit more. But then I was going to ask you a real practical one. As being somebody that led an aviation company, I don't know if you saw in the news the last, 2 or 3 days, where a college golf team was going to the national championships for their golf. And they saw out the window of their plane the baggage handlers taking their clubs. And there's actually video of it, so you see it. But the baggage handlers were throwing their clubs and just throwing them on the ground, then pick them up and throw them in the containers. What would you say, if you were the head of the aviation company, what would you say to those baggage handlers? How would you handle that?
Oh, my gosh.
As pastors, we have people that do similar kind of things in our churches. And so how would you handle that? What would you say to those guys?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I will tell you, like, one, you have to address it, right? And that would be one of those, because I don't even remember I did see that clip. And those are the types of people that, honestly, because I'm sure it's layers and layers and layers below the CEO, but I would imagine the CEO is clearly it's on press, so he will be addressing it. But how I would handle it personally, if it were my company, is I would actually want to have a call with them, or a face-to-face, if I could fly down there and meet with them face-to-face. That is one of those because just the fact that you flew down there will send, shock waves throughout the entire airport, and people will know, like, that word will spread very quickly, so they can see the magnitude of how important that is. Because at the end of the day, every employee is a brand ambassador of the company. And so, I'm sure that's not how I used to work for that airline. I can tell you that's not how we are taught. Right. And so when you think about things like that, and those are some of the challenges that leaders have to deal with, is because somebody will go and do something rogue, and then it puts the brand at risk. And so you do have to address it, and you have to address it in a way that sends messages to everybody else that, one, this won't be tolerated, but two, you almost want them to feel like, geez, I'd never do that. You know what I mean? Because you want to send that message so clearly, because this is it costs them bad reputation. It costs them bad press. And these are things that you can't necessarily put dollars and cents on. It is a hard thing to overcome. Think about when COVID was going on, and we had the doctor dragged off the plane for one of the major airlines. It took them years to recover from that one incident, So as leaders, we have to instill, and it comes back to company culture and what do we expect? And, you've got to always expect what you expect. So I would say somewhere along the line in that particular airport for that particular team, I would challenge what the leadership was like at that, airport, that people felt that emboldened that was okay. So there's a lot of issues to address,
There
you
are.
know.
Would anybody get fired over that, or would you look at that as a great teaching moment to say, we're not going to fire you, but the whole company better not do this again?
Yeah, it's a good question. If they've never done it before, then it's a teaching moment. If
Yeah.
there's a history there, because this one got caught on camera, doesn't mean it's not been ever done before, right?
Right.
So, and I wouldn't just look at the baggage handlers, the ones who were throwing it. I'd also look at their leaders.
Yeah.
And so I would go and do a forensic on that entire division and look at every single leader and look at every past incident and figure out, is there a trend here that hasn't been addressed? And if so, that needs to be addressed. Or is it just, we've got bad leadership that needs to be plucked up and plucked out and removed? Right.
Yeah.
So I'm not a person, this is the military in me. You grow up a dad, you grow up a father of a soldier, you're always taught to make decisions, make them quickly. And so you have to make quick decisions, and they're not always the easy ones. But
Yeah.
I will tell you, I have no problem making very quick decisions like that. They're out. Like, we're not, and because you still have to answer to the public on what you've done. How did it happen? What have you done? And how will you ensure it doesn't happen again? And
Yeah.
sometimes, people will be sacrificed in that process,
So, it's interesting. You use the word brand. How'd you say they are brand ambassadors? I think you said maybe.
Yep.
And so that's not only true in business, that's so true in church too, where, and again, you're
Yeah.
talking to the pastors of the 80 to 100 largest churches in Pennsylvania. And so they've got thousands of people in their churches. And all of those are brand ambassadors as well, not only for their church, but for Jesus and just our faith.
Mhm.
And I know even at LCBC, there was a time when there was a guy that wanted to buy bumper stickers that said LCBC or have something that he wanted to give to everybody in the church. And it sounded like a fun idea, but then we're like, oh, do we really want people
Right.
driving the way people drive with LCBC on their bumper stickers? So we chose not to do that for that very reason.
Mhm.
But that's
Yes.
a challenge of how do we make sure that the
Yep.
people, and it's usually not the CEO, it's usually the people that are
Mhm.
working with us and under us that are the most
Yes.
worrisome. So.
Exactly. And that's why, though, too, David, I think when it comes to leadership, we have to work so hard to make sure that the all employees, or in the church, that everybody knows the business that we're in, right? Because if you just think, I'm just I was a baggage handler, right? So that was a job that I did. If I just looked at it as, oh, I'm a baggage handler, I'm just a baggage handler, then my scope of view is going to be really narrow. But if I understand that, oh, my job is to, do whatever the brand promise is, then all of a sudden it's not just one piece. So one of the things that, and you and I have talked about this before, that I'm a big fan in leadership is that not only does everybody have to know the business that you're in, but you should also have the team do walk-a-miles. So everybody understands how everyone's job affects the job that they do or not do. Right? Because you're all one big unit. And so often, especially with bigger, whether it's churches or companies, people forget that. And so if you just think you're a baggage handler and you're not part of, literally creating an experience for people, then you'll do what we saw on TV, right?
Yeah,
Versus
exactly.
the really taking some pride. So yeah.
Exactly. That's great. Let me go back to the military question real quick. So was it really,
Sure.
would you credit growing up in a military family that caused you to strive for excellence then?
100%. That was the expectation. And that's exactly how I strived. And I will tell you, when I was a little girl going to school, right? So you're waiting for the bus to pick you up. The things that you would see, I think when you're a child, people don't, we think of what children see from a negative perspective, but we don't think about what children see from a positive perspective. So in my case, where I grew up around soldiers my whole life, I saw them with their pants always creased, right? They weren't wrinkly. Their hair was always in place. And, I'm sitting there waiting for the bus and I'm watching them, run and jog and do all kind of stuff. They've done more by 6 a.m. than most of us have done all day. And so the way that I've seen excellence portrayed was the expectation. There was always cause and effect. If I got in trouble on the base, let's say, it was my father who was called in to talk to the commander, not me, right? So you always knew that there was cause and effect. There was leadership and order and authority, right? So I grew up as a little girl knowing that. And therefore, how I led had a huge impact on how I led. It's like, we're not a free for all. There is an accountability process, and everybody holds that title, right? So,
Yeah.
you just instill that in the teams that you lead. But I saw that as a child, and I'm grateful for it, honestly.
So that's good. So one of the things that you just said, Stephanie, that I think is really important. Everything you said is important, but one of the things I want to make sure I highlight real quick. We
Mhm.
tend to, so oftentimes we tend to go after the person that made the mistake as opposed to the person above them that maybe didn't teach them how to make the right decisions. And so
Yes.
that's twice you brought that
Mhm.
up, both on the military base. Makes sense that it's going to be your dad that's going to get called in if you're
Yeah.
messing up. And so thinking that even in the church culture and leading, and our tendency is not to go after the person that's leading. We tend to be probably more, I don't know if gracious is the right word, or I don't know if
Mhm.
we're afraid that we're gonna have to replace them, and the other person that offended was maybe a volunteer, and so, but it's just an interesting thing that we probably ought to be thinking more about in the church world. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. I think that you always have to start with the leader. I
Yeah.
know when I was leading teams and sales teams, and I shared this story many times where one of my sales directors made a mistake, and it was a $325,000 mistake. And I was called into the CEO's office, not because of the mistake, but because the CEO wanted to know who made the mistake. So he wanted me to tell it was this person that made the mistake. And I wouldn't do it, right? Because I was going to handle it with the person, but I didn't do it because, one, my father always taught me always protect your team and always know there's two sides to every story. But as far as the CEO was concerned, that was my mistake. My team had a process, it wasn't followed. I will handle that, but I'm not going to throw my person under the bus to the CEO, because honestly, it's my responsibility. I'm the leader, and that team member didn't do the job as instructed, and outlined in our
Yeah.
process. And so, there's a lot of different ways that we as leaders have to always check, either one, first ourselves. So have I communicated the process correctly? And then if it wasn't followed, well, what check and balances do I have in place to make sure that there isn't any ample room for things not to be followed, right? So the
Yeah.
leader has to take most of the burden before we start pointing to the people that actually executed incorrectly.
And in church world, I think we're notorious, Stephanie, of we need a volunteer to serve someplace, and we're just so desperate. We're looking for bodies, and oftentimes we don't train them, and we don't follow up, and we don't really support them well. And then when it goes wrong, we're
Mhm.
frustrated with them. When, to your point, it probably is ours. So that's a great point. So, an
Well,
interesting
when
book
I
for
think
you.
of the military,
Go ahead. Yeah,
I
go
was just going to say, David, when I think of the military, they're taking people from all different backgrounds.
ahead.
And, that's one of the reasons for boot camp, right? Because you've got to strip them of all the different ways, because it's like the word quality. My version of quality and your version of quality, there's like, based on our lifestyle, has so many different meanings to it. So,
Right.
as leaders, back to the church and with volunteers, you've got to right size everybody, right? And quality is how you define it. You're the leader, you're creating the culture, and then it's up for everybody else to line up into that. And if they can't, then don't put them on the team, volunteer or paid employee, right? And so I think sometimes we overcomplicate things, but we all do it in our household with our families, right? It's not that complicated. Sometimes, to your point, we may be nervous because
Yeah.
resources are tight,
Yeah.
but it will harm you in the long run if you don't.
Yeah. So I love where you're going with that. So let me shift over to, you're writing a book right
Yeah.
now called Ally Leadership. Oh, you know what I was going to tell you, Stephanie? I think a great book for you to write, or a great talk
Mhm.
anyway, are just lessons you learned from your dad as a master sergeant. Because already in
Ooh.
this conversation, you've named several things that you were
Mhm.
taught or you learned through him and through the military. That would be a fun thing to hear and an interesting angle to
I
go to.
love that.
Um,
I love that. All right, it's on my agenda.
Good. With your book, Ally Leadership, as I'm understanding, well, one, I'm very much enjoying the opportunity to go through and read it, Stephanie, and I'm excited for it to be coming out and for others to read it. But I think a big piece of what you're saying is that almost what you just said, we come from so many different places, and somehow we've got to
Yeah.
figure out how to learn to work together and appreciate everybody, their backgrounds, and how to work and how to lead in that environment, which is challenging. And I would say one of the things that you talk about in your book is just the diversity that you have in the workforce, which may be different from the church, because in church we tend to all be pretty segregated. Still, we tend to not have that much diversity in the church. We know it's in the culture, may not be in the church.
Mhm.
Um, and I'm kind of going several places here. A side note is
Yeah, I
that's
like where you're
not
going though.
that. What's interesting in the church world, it's not just the white church that is very
Mhm.
segregated. It's the black church too. I
Right.
mean, and
100%. Yep.
yeah, and so it's just interesting to see. All that to say, though, you just then in your comment about right sizing, you said, you'll have employees that are all coming from all different places, and so you've got to say this is the way we operate. So how does
Mhm.
that even fit with, and maybe we need to answer several other questions before we get here. How does all that fit with the diversity that's there and appreciating people's background and diversity, but then saying, but this is the way we do it here? Does that make sense what I'm asking?
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. And that's sometimes the challenge, right? Because so in the book, just to bring your audience up to speed, the book, the way that I'm addressing it is about in marketplace, we've got 5 generations working. So that's a first ever. So we've got people who are 16 all the way to 75 in the workforce right now. And so as a leader, that's challenging. How do you lead, a boomer versus a zoomer have completely different thought processes and expectations and perspectives. So the intergenerational situation that we leaders find ourselves in, that alone can be enough to keep
Yeah,
people up at night because
yeah,
you're just trying to lead and meet everybody where they're at. The second part of it is we have women now, the majority of the world's population. So women are bringing in a completely different dynamic, and that has changed things as well. And then, of course, we have the demographics, right, where the Black race, the Asian race, the Hispanic race continues to grow, the white race continues to shrink. So there's a lot of different dimensions, not to mention everything going on with neurodiversity or LGBTQ plus. I mean, there's just so many pieces to this whole thing. So the book itself is all about all of us. No, we as leaders or aspiring leaders, we are going to be leading people who are not like us,
yeah,
period. And
yeah.
that's what the book is really designed to do, is to say, here's how I've done it, and so in hopes that it will help other people to be successful at it as well. So that's the premise of the book. Now, when you think about how do we do this, I use the word ally. The title is ally leadership, but ally stands for ask, listen, learn. And then you, the why, you take action. Because here's what's really interesting. When we think about the word ally or allyship or anything like that, you can't you can't say you're an ally. Like, it's not something that you can decide, right? Other people have to decide if you're an ally. So I can't just say, oh, yeah, I'm an ally. And people do this all the time, right? Yeah, I'm an ally. It's like, well, are you? Like, so tell
Yeah.
me exactly what you've done to show your allyship. And that's usually where people get a little stuck because they don't have the receipts to back up the statement. Right. And so
Right.
that's really what I'm attempting to do with the book, is just to get all leaders to right size and go, listen, all of us need help with this because this is a very unique time that we're in. Leadership is needed more than ever, no matter what part of the globe you're on. And so, how do we do this together? And to come in with an attitude of, I don't know everything.
Yeah.
And so, if I can come in and ask questions and listen and learn, that's half the battle. And once I come in literally with an open mind to understand, then that's going to allow me to take action in areas that align with my belief, my values, et cetera, in areas that I can understand it a little bit more. And so what we've had, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Stephanie, so again, probably back to my question a minute ago, asking,
Mhm.
listening, and learning doesn't mean that, okay, now I've asked, I've listened, I've learned from you, and so therefore we're going to go your way. It really
Right.
is saying we still have a direction we're going as an organization. We have policies and standards and what we're looking for,
Yep.
quality.
Mhm.
So I'm listening, I'm learning from you, but now let's all get together and go the direction that this organization is going. So it's not acquiescing to everybody's desires or interest at all.
Not at all. It's just being open, because out of the opening of listening and learning, you may find where there's like, oh, that's actually a really good idea. We could adjust our stuff because that makes more sense, right? And so
Yeah.
by asking, listening, and learning, if you're truly learning, you'll probably find some areas where you're like, oh, okay, that could actually benefit all of us, or what have you.
Yeah.
And then the reverse is true as well. So though we as leaders are asking, listening, and learning, we're also, if you set that if you're doing that, your people will know that that's the expectation, which allows them to also ask, listen, and them also learn too, right? So we, the leaders, have to just, create the example, but it's a two-way street, because at the end of the day, we're a team and the team has to win. right? And everybody wants to be on a winning team. So that means there are times I'm going to have to learn some things that are out of my area of expertise, and you're expecting your employees to do it as well. I think the biggest changes that's, in my opinion, David, that I've seen happen over the past several years, and COVID, I think, just expedited the whole thing, is the fact that we leaders, once upon a time, were always positioned where we had all the answers.
Yeah.
And then so that was a bit of a burden. And depending on the leader, it was maybe a power play too, right? So once COVID happened and everything shifted, where the employees really took time to reevaluate their lives and go, you know what, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to do that, or this is what matters to me, or my family. I need to put more time in with my family. Whatever it was, they came out of this now where the dynamics had shifted and the employees had the control, right? They're like, I'm not going into the office. I am working, from home. And so they were starting to call the shots, and we leaders were like, whoa, 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 what's going on? I can't get them back in the office, right? or I can't get them back to church. And so all the dynamics changed, and we had to realize that, okay, we have to walk this back a little bit and sit and listen and learn and figure out how are we going to create a workplace that's beneficial for all, because at the end of the day, we still need to get the job done. So I love, just when I look back on leadership in general, who we were as leaders up until 2020 are very different than who we are as leaders now at 2024. And it will be very different that how do we lead in 2026, 2030, right? Because everything's changing. And that's where the generational stuff comes into play, because every generation has a different expectation of how they see the world. And so we leaders have to constantly dance, know?
I love what you're saying. What I've sensed from pastors, and so it's reassuring to hear it's happening with business leaders too, is I think COVID, all the political unrest, all the racial unrest of the last several years have left pastors staggering, where I think going into COVID, we all thought we kind of had this figured out and we know how to do things. And coming out of COVID in the last several years, we're all going, I don't have a clue how to do this anymore. And so I think part of what you're saying with your book is even just those whole asking questions, listening, learning from others is huge. And so real encouraging to hear that. The other thing that I find fascinating in reading your book, Stephanie, is as you talk about your situation and the environment in the business world, you're as you write, you don't say LGBTQ is right or wrong. You just present the fact it's there. It's not like you have a choice on will you deal with it or not. It's there in your face. It's people that are in your organization. So how do I lead in this environment? I think in the church world, we kind of have a choice if we let people that are different from us in or not. And so it's a different environment where I appreciate it helps me understand more what business leaders are going through, because we can be insulated in the church. You can't so much in the business world.
Exactly. And that's where we really, really need our pastor. All leaders that are believers have a pastor that, we sit under the authority, right? And so it's like that's where we really need the most help, or we really need our pastors to lean in and give us some good guidance, right? Because because we can't just go, okay, well, here's how I see things, or here's my belief. And so therefore I'm just not, I, as an executive, I have a fiscal responsibility to make sure I've got the best people in the best position that can drive the business forward, period. What they do, who they are, all that stuff, I can't get bogged down into that. My investors and stockholders are expecting I've got the right people in the right place to produce the right result. Done, right? And so where it gets a little complex, right, is when you have all these other things that we've just mentioned earlier that you may or may not understand, it's very complex. And so what I would say for, since we're talking to pastors, is if you have leaders in your church that are leading companies, divisions, teams, et cetera, just know that these are the things that they're challenged with. But when we look for our leadership, which is our pastors, we need to understand where do you say the Bible stands in certain areas, and not so much. Some stuff's really clear, like we know where the Bible stands in a lot of areas, but it doesn't. What I'm quite questioning is how then we have to treat them and respect them and love them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
We may not
Yeah.
line up with, every different group's values, and the values may not align, all that stuff, but we still have a job to do. It would be ideal for pastors to come together and think and have those kind of conversations of how do you give direction of how do we lead, the different complexities that are out there. So it almost becomes, honestly, you're right, that other part's almost a moot point, right?
Yeah.
Because we still have a job to do, right?
Yeah.
And so, and we will have within our teams people that are not like us,
Yeah.
and in every shape, form, and fashion, whether it's sexual orientation, gender, race, age, disabilities, like the list goes on and on and on, right? And so, how then do we make sure? Because at the end of the day, we still have to love people. Right. And we still
Yeah.
have to lead people. And
Yeah.
so how do we do that and still, stay true to what it is our beliefs are?
Stephanie, let me ask you
Mhm.
real quick. And so
Sure.
obviously you're a person of faith, and
Mhm.
you're in a church. And oftentimes it's hard for pastors to know how to deal with people like you. You are strong, you're powerful, you have great ideas, you've had amazing experiences in business, you're a leader. And so pastors, on one hand, are thrilled that you're in the church, usually because they hope you're going to bring finances to the church and you're going to give to the church. But then it's like, now what do we do with you? And so
Yeah.
how would you encourage our pastors to deal with people like yourself? How do we best utilize you and make it fulfilling for you as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would say, one, you have to know that we even exist in your church, right? So you really have to know your people. So that's the first thing. And then know what it is that we do. And then I would say use us for our intellectual property. Meaning, and you've heard my story before when I was put in children's ministry, which was not the ministry I should have
Yeah,
been put in.
describe that a little bit. Describe that a
Oh
little
my
bit.
gosh. Okay, it's funny and yet crazy, right? So many years ago, as a new believer, and I was going to a small church in Florida, had like 500 families, and I was growing a ton in that church as far as just my spiritual maturity and things of that nature. And so when you're a young believer, you're like, I'll do anything for Jesus. And so they're like, all right. One of the elders said, Steph, I'm gonna put you in the children's ministry. And I, I didn't want to like, are you sure? I was like, okay. So I start working in children's ministry, could not stand it. Okay. And I was trying to find ways to fling myself out the window because this truly was not my calling. And though I love kids, it's just not something I wanted to do. But I was willing to do it because, I was submitting, right? My pastor sees me one day on a Sunday and he sees me in the hallway and he's like, Chung, where were you? I didn't see you in church. And I go, oh, well, they have me in children's ministry. And he goes, what? He's like, no, move her. That's definitely not her gift. And I was like, right? Like, I don't think this is my gift either. But I'm so grateful that he wasn't just, we got a body, stick it in there, right? It's just like, no. Where should people be based on their gifting? So what I would say, getting back to your question, is where you want to use your leaders that are in your church is based on what do they do for work,
Yeah.
because that's going to be the stuff that's very natural to us. So when they moved me, going back to that story, because this happened like however many years, 20 some odd years ago, when they moved me out of children's ministry, where they put me and where I thrived was in the parking lot ministry. And the reason why I could do the parking lot ministry great is because I knew how to park planes at the Boston Logan Airport, right? I had that church parking lot flowing like butter, baby. It was like no lines. We were moving. There wasn't any it worked so great because I knew how to park planes at a very busy airport and, all the things that it takes. So that's an example of, though I'm a woman, it doesn't mean I should be in children's ministry. What is it that I do? And then really try to mirror that, right? So what I would tell pastors now, fast forward, is, when you have executives in your church, in your congregation, what is it that they do for a living? Because that's the stuff that we are probably very gifted in and that we can help the most. So I'll use, if there's a woman in your church and she happens to be in finance or she's a CFO, don't ask her to make cookies for the youth group, right? Nothing wrong with it. And if she likes making cookies, but ask her like, hey, you know what? I'd love for you to take a look at this. This is where we're being challenged, or we're trying to grow our margin contribution. What are your thoughts? She'll be able to rattle off stuff because this is what she does all day. So I would say for the pastors, look at your entire congregation, less about gender and all that stuff, and look more on what is it that they do as a profession, and then talk to them about that. If I'm in someone's church and I'm a growth officer and you want to figure out how do I grow the church, I'm probably a person you want to ask a couple questions to, right? Because I'm going to be able to rattle stuff off, and I'll be able to ask you questions that will have you thinking a different way, because this is what I do, right? So that's what I would say. Again, I think it would take a burden off pastors to feel like you've got to, carry such a big load. I'm sure in most people's churches, you've got so much talent that they would love to be able to share their knowledge, especially if they belong to the church and they love the church and they want to be, see it grow and develop and be strong. They're going to be able to tell you stuff that, that won't take anything but a couple minutes of their time to really be able to just pour into areas that could probably be really helpful. I would say the flip side of that as well is the couple minutes of their time, or maybe it's an hour at lunch, or, what have you. You just have to be mindful as well, because everybody's so strapped on time. And so, if there's anything that you can do that condenses the time, it's really important. Nobody wants to spend, 6 weeks or 6 months doing, stuff, right? So it's like, if they're good at what they do, a couple of minutes, they will shed and pour so much insight into what could probably help you in the ministry a lot.
That's fantastic. Yeah, what I found, Stephanie, is exactly what you're saying, where I can best utilize the talent in the church of people like yourself, not asking you to sit on a committee, not asking you to do ongoing things, but really it's more one-offs. We've got a project we're working on. How can I do this better? Whether it's finances, whether it's building buildings, whether it's multi-site, whatever it may be. And I've found that the people I've tapped on the shoulder to help me with that love doing that. And they're great asset to me and to the church. So yeah, that's great.
Exactly.
Stephanie, it's been wonderful talking to you. You're a lot of fun to talk to. I appreciate you. I appreciate your love for church and for Jesus, and the fact that you're somebody out in the world, and even with your book. And when will your book be released? Is that coming out soon?
So yes, it's going to be out. The official date is August 13th. Okay. And so super excited about it. If anybody's interested, they can go on to stephaniechung.com/book, and we're doing pre-orders and signed copies now, but it will officially launch and be everywhere August 13th.
That's great. I think what I appreciate again about the book, it's not even just business people that we're talking about. It is the church. And even as you and I are talking again today, there are so many correlations, and people are people, organizations are organizations, and whether you put the label church or business on it, it doesn't really change the people or the need for organizations. So a lot of overlaps. I think it's going to be a great book, not only for business people, but for pastors and the church as well. So thank you for taking time with us and speaking into the pastors' lives, and excited about where the book goes, and excited about where you continue to go, seeing your influence expand. And so happy for that. So Stephanie, thank you. Appreciate you very much.
Thank you. All right. Thank you so much, David. I appreciate it. Take care now.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Advantage Podcast with David Ashcraft, and for participating in our goal to strengthen and encourage pastors and their churches so more people are introduced to Jesus across Pennsylvania. If you found this helpful, feel free to pass it along. To find out more about the work of The Advantage, visit our website at theadvantage.org.